All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're taking a deep dive into something pretty fascinating. It's all about India
Okay.
and their maritime sector.
Interesting.
We're talking about a country with thousands of miles of coastline
Yeah.
that
Right.
could be a real global player in shipping. But here's the thing, and this is what makes it so interesting, is they rely
Oh,
on foreign ships for almost all of their trade, like 95%,
wow.
which is a lot.
That is a lot.
So we're going to see, can they change that? Can they really become this maritime
Yeah.
powerhouse, or is it just too big of a hurdle to overcome?
Huh?
We're looking at this awesome editorial summary
Okay.
called India's Need for Stronger Maritime Infrastructure.
Yeah.
And it really lays out some of the challenges and some potential solutions.
Great.
So to really get started,
Right.
paint us a picture of the current situation.
Well, I think the first thing to keep in mind is that India is kind of losing out financially right now in this arrangement because relying on foreign ships means that they're paying a huge amount of money in freight costs. We're talking over $100 billion.
$100 billion, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Think about
I mean, that's like the GDP of some
it's
tire
a huge amount of money.
Yeah.
And it's money that could be used, within the country to develop a domestic shipping industry.
And I imagine that, especially, we always hear about this kind of global uncertainty.
Oh, absolutely.
And I imagine that makes that dependence
Even riskier.
it is a vulnerability for
crap.
sure. I mean, look at countries like China,
Right.
South Korea, Japan,
The big players.
the big players.
Yeah.
They control something like 93% of the global market for shipbuilding.
Wow, 93%.
Yeah.
So that really puts it into perspective,
Yeah.
compared to,
Huge disparity.
yeah,
It's almost like, if you think about it, it's like relying on your neighbors for
Right.
all your groceries.
all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. So what is India doing about this? They must be, I imagine they know,
Oh, yeah,
can
definitely.
always recognize this.
So they've recognized this. So they've put some pretty significant initiatives in place to address this.
Okay.
The first one, and this is their big overarching plan, is called Maritime India Vision 2030.
Okay.
And then they have another program called the Sagarmala program, and that's specifically focused on port development
Yeah.
and also improving the lives of coastal communities.
Okay.
And then the third one, which I think is pretty interesting, is called the Harit Sagar Initiative.
Harit Sagar. Now, what is that?
Harit Sagar means it translates to green seas.
Oh, green seas. Okay.
It's focused on environmental sustainability.
I mean, that's great.
Yeah.
But can you really have these green initiatives, and still keep up
Yeah, that's a great question.
with this need to develop quickly?
Right. It's a balance, right? You want to grow quickly, but
Yeah.
you also want to do it in a way that's sustainable, environmentally responsible.
Mm.
And so Harit Sagar is really about, promoting things like using renewable energy in ports, adopting cleaner technologies for ships. And, there are some questions about whether that can be done effectively without sort of sacrificing the speed
Yeah.
of development.
Right. Because I imagine these are all quite expensive to implement, these sorts of things.
Yes.
So speaking of cost, one thing that I was reading about was how hard it is
Yes.
to actually get financing
Oh, yeah.
for ships
That is a huge hurdle.
in India.
It is. It is. And it really comes down to this thing called the Sarfazi Act.
Okay.
So the Sarfazi Act, it essentially helps banks recover bad loans.
Right.
But ships in India, they don't have infrastructure status,
All right.
which means they're not covered under this act.
So what's the implication of that?
Well, the banks get really nervous,
Right.
They're not sure that they're going to be able to recover their money if the loan goes bad.
Right. So it makes it much harder.
So it makes it much harder to get financing for shipbuilding.
Right. So it's like you need the ships
Exactly.
to build the industry,
You need the industry, you need the ships,
but you can't
but you can't get the money to do it.
get the money. Yeah. So it's a real catch-22.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about the financing for the ships. What about the ports themselves? Are the ports in India? I mean, are they sort of up to the task?
Well, that's another area where they're facing some challenges. A lot of the ports, they just aren't as efficient as they could be.
Okay.
Turnaround times can be quite long, and a lot of them just don't have the facilities
Right.
to handle the really, really big ships.
Yeah. Those massive,
The massive container ships.
that are dominating global trade these days.
Right.
So what ends up happening is that a lot of Indian cargo ends up having to go through what are called transshipment hubs,
Okay.
like Singapore or Colombo, for example.
And so what's the downside of that?
Well, it adds time, right? So it adds time, it adds cost.
It's like taking an extra flight. Right?
Exactly. Instead of having a direct flight, you've got to have a layover.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's that kind of inefficiency, and it really undermines India's overall goal of, becoming more self-reliant and really sort of taking control of its own, destiny in the maritime sector.
Right.
If they had more efficient ports that could handle these big ships, it would be a real game changer.
Yeah. So even if they can build the ships and fix the ports, I mean, who's gonna manage all of this?
Right.
Is India's workforce, is it ready?
Well, that's another big piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. And to be honest, there is a pretty significant skills gap right now.
Okay.
In the Indian maritime sector. And it's really in areas like, things that are becoming more and more important, like automation,
Right.
data analytics, modern logistics management.
Right. It's a very different type of industry
It is, yeah.
than it was, even 10 or 20 years ago.
Absolutely.
Much more high tech.
Yeah, that's a much more high-tech industry, and India needs to really focus on developing that expertise.
Right. And, we can't talk about India without talking about
Oh, yes.
the famous or infamous
Bureaucracy.
bureaucracy, So how is that impacting how's that impacting the maritime sector?
It's definitely a hurdle. I mean, there are a lot of regulations.
Okay.
And sometimes it can feel like they overlap, and then that can lead to delays because you've got and then just a mountain of paperwork. And all of that really can, kind of bog things down.
Right.
It can really slow down projects, drive up the costs.
Yeah. It's almost like, just as you're, trying to build momentum,
Exactly.
you hit a wall.
You hit a wall.
So it's financing, it's the ports, it's skills, it's bureaucracy. I mean, it sounds like there are a lot of big challenges here.
There are challenges, but it's not hopeless.
No, and the editorial we were talking about,
They have some solutions.
they have some solutions, they've got some ideas.
Yeah.
So let's jump into those.
Okay.
So one of the first ones that they talk about is setting up something called a National Port Grid Authority.
Right.
What is that?
So basically, this is about simplifying things.
Okay.
It's about improving coordination.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of having multiple authorities, kind of tripping over each other and creating these bottlenecks, you'd have one authority
Right.
responsible for overseeing port development.
So less red tape, more
Efficiency.
more efficiency, hopefully. And then there's this idea of smart ports.
Ah, yes.
I feel like I'm hearing that everywhere these days.
It's a big buzzword.
So what does that actually mean?
Well, the idea behind smart ports is to really leverage technology.
Yep.
I mean, we're talking about things like automation, artificial intelligence, blockchain,
Right.
and using these technologies to really optimize every aspect of port operations. So, minimizing those turnaround times we talked about,
Right.
making everything much more efficient, improving security. So it's really about using technology to sort of to create a more seamless, transparent, and secure environment.
Right. And I think that idea of connectivity, we were talking about those transshipment hubs.
Right.
And how India needs to sort of become less dependent on those extra stops. So they talk about something called multimodal connectivity.
Okay.
What does that actually mean?
So multimodal connectivity, it's basically, about linking different modes of transport. So in India's case, we're primarily talking about rail and road networks that are specifically designed for freight.
Okay.
So these are called dedicated freight corridors.
Okay.
And these are absolutely essential because if you can move cargo quickly and efficiently from a port to an inland destination, that is going to reduce your costs,
Yeah.
It's going to make you much more competitive.
And it's going to get the trucks
Fewer trucks on the road.
off those congested roads.
Yeah. I mean, anyone who's spent time in India knows that that the roads can be a challenge.
So we talked about green, we talked about Haritsagar.
Right.
In terms of ships, what about green port initiatives?
Yes. So it's about applying those same sustainability principles, but to the ports themselves.
Okay.
So that could mean things like, powering port operations with solar and wind energy.
Okay.
It could mean implementing really effective waste management systems,
Okay.
really minimizing the environmental impact of all those operations.
Yeah. So again, I mean, it seems like, all this stuff is really great,
Yeah,
but I imagine it's quite expensive.
it is.
So how can they actually get the money to do this?
Right. Well, that's where private investment comes in.
Okay.
A lot of these initiatives, they're just too large,
Right.
too expensive for the government to do alone. So they really need to bring the private sector on board.
Right.
And the best way to do that is, to make it attractive, to make it a sort of a good investment opportunity.
And they talk about these PPPs, these public-private partnerships.
Yes.
So what are those, and how can they work in this context?
Well, so PPPs are basically about sharing the risks
Okay.
and the rewards
Right.
of these big infrastructure projects. So the government basically says, look, we have this project, we need your expertise, we need your capital,
Okay.
but we're also willing to share the risk with you.
Right.
And that can be a very attractive proposition for private investors.
Right. So they don't have to bear the entire burden.
Exactly.
If things go wrong.
Exactly.
So it's a shared responsibility. So we kind of started out talking about how dependent India is on foreign vessels.
Yeah.
The fact that they're, losing all this money.
Mm-hmm.
But there seem to be some really interesting ideas
There are.
about how they can actually change this
Absolutely.
and really become a global maritime power.
And I think, the key is going to be, are they able to actually implement these solutions?
Right.
Are they able to make those changes?
Because it's one thing to have
You can have a great plan,
a great plan, a great vision.
but execution is everything.
Yeah, you got to actually do it.
Absolutely.
So I think that's a great point to leave our listeners with.
Okay.
If India can do this, if they can pull this off,
Yeah.
what does that mean for global shipping? What does that mean for other countries?
Mm-hmm.
How does that change the balance of power in global trade?
It would be a real shift.
Yeah. So there's a lot to think about there.
A lot to think about.
So thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And thanks to all of our listeners for listening to this deep dive.